actually in 1997, the government of Aragon started wondering a little bit what the future holds for the area and the people in Aragon. Mainly because the work in the region was dominated by one company, a company that I happened to come from previously, General Motors. General Motors employed about at that time, 14,000 people in Zaragoza. And they wondered what's happening to the automotive industry and if we should put all our eggs in one basket. And they thought and said, okay, what should we do? And at that time, of course, they didn't call it a logistics cluster. That's academics put that term on it after the fact. But they created a logistics cluster. And this is what the area where that logistics cluster currently exists looked like in 2001. It was just barren land, not even well farmed. After about 6 years in 2007, this is what it started looking like. Mainly, there was an airport there, so it provided one means of transport. And interestingly, this airport has one of the longest runways in Europe and one of the strongest runways in Europe because it was built for the American Air Force as the landing site for the space shuttle in case it needed to land in Europe. And that airport, of course, can handle any plane, without any problem of today's size, 747 and Illusion, and you see a lot of them in the Zaragoza airport. In addition to that, in the late 1990s, early 2000s, Spain went on a building boom, and they built a lot of highways, very good highways, and so at this point you can see that there was a link to Madrid, a link to Barcelona, and a link to Valencia, all from that point. And those are the three biggest cities in Spain. In addition, Spain also built what I consider the best high-speed rail system in the world today. It's the only high-speed rail system which guarantees your money back if the train is more than 15 minutes late. Okay? And I've lived there 4 years and I've never got my money back. So, but it built the high-speed rail, and it also has a rail connection between Madrid and Barcelona. So immediately now, at this point in Spain, you have three modes of transport. And remember this fact because this becomes important. As we go on, the first company to be installed there was a company called Inditex. Probably most of you know this company by its better-known name of Zara. And Zara has become probably the single most dominant company in the fashion merchandising business with all its different brands. And it continues to do very, very well. This is what Plaza looks like. I was going to say today, but it looked like a year ago. It's built up a little bit more. Right now, there's Inditex still there. Caladero is another company that I will talk about a little bit later. A shopping center has been added. But from a logistics standpoint, the most important thing was the intermodal terminal. This is a terminal between road and rail that's been added to take advantage of the rail connections. And just for a comparison, the size of Plaza, that's the Plataforma Logística de Aragon, is 13 million square meters, which makes it the largest logistics location in Southern Europe. About 350 companies currently operate there today with about 12,000 employees. So in a sense, it has helped the objective of diversification away from the automotive industry, but it's also created a whole new concept of a logistics hub. Interestingly, the Zaragoza Logistics Center, where we come from, is also located in this little corner down there, mainly because we wanted to have some sort of an education facility as part of the logistics cluster. And we will talk a little bit more about that. Zara, for example, currently, just to give you a little bit of an idea, they just added this big warehouse, which is another 18,000 square meters. They call it the largest hanging closet in Europe. It contains basically a totally automated warehouse for hanging clothes, for clothes that move on hangers. This Zara currently has over 6,000 stores worldwide. Last year they opened another 500. And this warehouse here in Zaragoza supplies every single one of the Zara women's stores in the world. So every dress that you buy, every blouse, every belt that's a woman's clothing that goes into Zara Women comes from this warehouse. It comes in from all over the world and it's shipped back out all over the world. Each Zara store has a 48-hour response time, which means that all this product is shipped out by air. Now you see why that airport becomes interesting and necessary. Literally, they ship out a 747 every 12 hours out of that airport. The other company that's interesting is Caladero. This is a fish processing company. In case you didn't know, after Japan, Spain and Spaniards eat more fish per capita than anybody else in the world. And this fish, they're fished out all the waters around Spain, so they have to go very far abroad to get this fish to come in. So a lot of it is shipped in from South Africa, New Zealand, and so on. This company processes that thing for pretty much all of Spain. They ship about 200,000 tons of fish every year through this outfit. Of course, we have other companies like Kuehne+Nagel and so on. In the course of this presentation, I will use a lot of content. I'm not going to refer to each of it by name, but a lot of it comes from Plaza, the documentation from Plaza. Some of it comes from Yossi Sheffi, so you can think I'm really standing in for Yossi Sheffi here. A lot of it comes from European projects that we are doing that are very focused on building logistics clusters. One of them is called WIN, the European Platform Driving Knowledge and Innovation in Freight Logistics, and the other is So Cool at EU. And I think it's important for me to mention the names of those two because they sponsor a lot of work at our center. So, those are my sources, and we now will get into a little bit of this. Okay, first question. Where did most of the diamonds in the world come from before the year 1800? Anybody in the room know the answer? Somebody needs to know it here. Not South Africa, wrong. Most of the diamonds in the world before 1800 came from India. The vast majority of diamonds came from India. The initial diamond processing center was not Antwerp, but it was Bruges. In the 1700s, the river Zin, forgive my pronunciation, you would probably know how to pronounce that much better, silted up, and as a result, the ships couldn't go up to Bruges, and this is a classic example of a logistics failure. And Bruges lost out to Antwerp. In the 1800s, the dominant city in the region was Amsterdam, and they forcefully took the diamond processing industry away from Antwerp. They decided to do the high-quality diamonds and left Antwerp with the low-quality diamonds. Now, what happened in 1856 was diamonds were found in South Africa, in Kimberley, in large quantities. And for the first time, these were rough diamonds. What the people in Antwerp had done was they had innovated both the techniques for cutting rough diamonds and the tools to develop the capability to build those diamonds up into really high quality diamonds. So when these rough diamonds started flowing into Europe for cutting, Antwerp again became the dominant center. And it hasn't given that up. Now it shares it a little bit with Mumbai, does the rough cutting, but Antwerp still dominates. So what I'm trying to get at is that it wasn't just a fortune thing. It was a combination of innovation in cutting skills and technology and the king. The main thing that I want to bring out in a logistics cluster, and I'll make my point here and I'll continue it on throughout, is that for a logistics cluster to continue to be successful, you need the innovation. Okay? Another example very near and dear to my heart are automotives in Detroit. While Detroit possessed a lot of good attributes like having raw materials and things like that, like coal was abundant, iron ore was abundant, and so on, It was really the innovation of the assembly line that cemented Detroit's place in the auto industry as the auto industry hub. Before, in the 1900 to 1910 time frame, there were actually about 126 automotive companies in Detroit. Those all got consolidated into GM, Ford, and Chrysler, and a few other smaller ones that ultimately got absorbed in. But again, creating the cluster was the innovation part of it. So why do people cluster? One of the big reasons is trust. If you are in a close contact with a person, and I think all of you know this, if you know somebody, and again, this might change in the future with internet and all that, but a personal handshake often means a lot to people doing business. In fact, in the diamond business, most of the contracts are personal handshakes, and people hand over 50,000, 500,000, $1 million worth of diamonds based on that. So it's the trust aspect of it. You get people to build, and by working together. Probably more important than that is also what's called tacit knowledge exchange. No matter how many contracts you write to people that they can't talk to each other and share information, being in the same location, there's a lot of knowledge that's shared. This happens in Silicon Valley, this happens in Zaragoza, everywhere in Plaza. You find that companies, and you can, more importantly, also have the ability for people to move easily without having to make major shifts or move their family across wrong locations. It also helps in collaboration. Part of the reason I talked a little bit about those two companies, Caladero and Inditex, both of them use air freight because fish has to stay fresh, and Inditex, that's their business model. Inditex ships a lot of wool from South Africa. Wool is bulky, but it doesn't weigh out a plane. Fish is not very bulky, but it weighs out a plane fast. And so interestingly, they've started sharing a plane. I don't know how long they will go on doing it, but they do it. Because the wool might start smelling of fish or vice versa. I don't know about that. But in any case, they've figured out that. So this is a classic example of some collaborative opportunities that come up when you're close together. The last remaining point is that you have a broader supply base. So today, if you are going to set up or you're going to talk to a logistics provider, your natural destination, if you're in Aragon, is to go to Plaza because there are 10 different companies. Actually, there are like 35 different logistics companies there, and you can talk to them very quickly. You also have a very broad talent pool in the location. And this talent can migrate from one company to another, but it's still in the area. And hopefully ZLC, this is a little plug for ZLC, we bring the research and education part of it to support that. This all goes back to Michael Porter, who says, by having these clusters, we enable each member to benefit as if it had greater scale without requiring to sacrifice its flexibility. And that is kind of true. In the case of Aragon, the main thrust was to replace manufacturing jobs in case they were lost. They had alternates in there. And logistics jobs, by definition, are less susceptible to offshoring. You have to deliver the goods to the consumer in the region, and you can't do that by offshoring the job to Mexico. Okay, so it has to be in that. So they thought that's a good strategy. It also served as providing an infrastructure for other industries. What you see here is a company called Imaginarium. They build children's toys, and they're reasonably successful, but they decided to locate not just their warehouse, but they located their design facility and their production facility and their warehouse in this location to take advantage of the logistics opportunities. So more and more you see companies doing that. A lot of companies also do it for service reasons, for service opportunities, because it's easy to bring product in, get it serviced, and send it back out. So in this case here, we're talking about what makes clusters successful. I think it goes back to the old real estate adage. It has to be location, location, location. If you don't have the location, it doesn't quite work. And that location needs access. You've got to be able to access the location quite easily. And ideally, you have multiple modes. In Zaragoza's case, we have the 3 modes physically present, and we now have the virtual mode of maritime because containers that come into the port of Algeciras in the south of Spain, Valencia on the east coast, or Barcelona on the east coast can be taken to Zaragoza either by train or by truck in an inbound. So the customs clearance is not carried out at the port of entry, but at the intermodal port in Zaragoza. So literally you have all 4 modes arriving there. As you can see, we try to push Zaragoza as being the center of the universe. And in this case, it's true for probably the Iberian Peninsula. It forms a very good satellite location that can feed most of the areas. So, one of the other things that happens in clusters is that because you're a cluster, you have material flowing in and material flowing out. It makes it a lot easier to do things like have full loads and backhauls. The frequency of shipments is a lot more often, and you have several competitors. Now, you might think that having several competitors is bad. Let me give you an example. There are 2 major trucking companies, and these are in the top 5 companies in Spain that are located in Zaragoza in this thing. One is Carreras and other is the Cese. Both of them compete for the General Motors business. 1 year, one of them won the business, and what happened was a lot of the drivers and stuff migrated over to that company. 3 years later, the other company won it back, and they all migrated back. But it was done without any disruption to the drivers' personal lives, families, and so on, even though the companies lost business. So they understand that this is an important fact, and they tend to work together. They're still very tough competitors, but they understand the relationship that's needed to make things work for them. The other thing is that if you have a cluster with intermodal connections is one thing, but when you have a cluster that's so condensed, it's easy to have intermodal feeds to specific companies. So in Zaragoza's case, all the companies within this red circle have direct rail access. So if you think you need rail access, and if you're moving heavy goods, like Bosch Siemens moves heavy goods, they have that, their warehouses are located here. Inditex is located here because they don't use rail, period. So, we talked about this, and there are other efficiencies. The next step for a logistics cluster is really, yes, you are a distribution center, but what makes it a cluster? How do you add value? And this is where we start talking about the types of things that we can do. One of the things is product finishing. If you work in the automotive industry, usually if you have a port and you import vehicles to the port, you do a lot of value-added services to the vehicles at the port of entry. That's one thing. This type of thing is now happening at the warehouses. So you can do a lot of customization, especially if there's customization for e-commerce sales in the warehouses, in the distribution centers that are located in there. We can do sequence delivery. For those of you in the automotive industry, you know, the automotive industry loves to have things delivered in sequence, and a lot of the sequencing actually happens back at the distribution center, and then the last mile delivery to the factory, and then service and repair. You can fly things in, do service, and have the repair. Let me give you an example of value added in the fish industry. Initially, when Caladero, that company, set up, they purely used to collect the fish, and they had their own ships out in the oceans, put it on a plane, ship it into their distribution center, and ship it out on trucks to Spain. Now they have started saying to the supermarkets, let us cut up your fish for you and individually package the fish for you and maybe sort it for you and all that. And the supermarkets like it because it eliminates something that's a rather messy business in the supermarket and enables them to keep that. So they've entered into a deal with Carrefour and I think also with Mercadona to do all the fish processing for them in the center. So this is kind of a value-added concept that happens in there. One of the things that you need to make a logistics cluster work, of course, is infrastructure, and I'll talk a little bit about it. The picture you see in the background is the intermodal terminal at the plaza. It has the physical infrastructure, but importantly, it also provides, through the local bank, some of the financial and transactional infrastructure and the energy that's needed there. This part of it is actually directed more to the government people in the audience. There is a strong role for government, especially when you create this type of large-scale infrastructure. An individual company, especially an individual logistics company, often can't create this. Even a rail company doesn't have the resources to create feeders into a lot of distribution centers, into a lot of companies. In Zaragoza's case, you can read all that, but I'll tell you what exactly happened. They bought most of the land from private ownership, and this is where the government was very effective in bringing this in. The local government purchased the land. The regional government established the utilities and brought in the utilities. This is the power, electricity, information technology, and all that. And the rail infrastructure was provided by the national government. So there was a combination of all three governments feeding each other. And then, of course, the companies brought in the assets that are more the operational assets and the facilities actually needed to do this. So far, I think what we've seen is it's brought a lot of new jobs into the area. Some of those jobs have been increased wages. Most of the time, distribution center jobs are not really high-paying jobs. And so there's a constant pressure to say, okay, what is the value add that can happen? And then that adds more value into the jobs. It's also allowed a lot of small logistics firms to get easy access to both the resources in the distribution center, as well as being able to partner with other companies and bid for projects. What are the risk factors for logistics clusters? One of the biggest ones is energy prices. If prices go up and you are not going to be shipping as much as far as you can, then there's a lot less need for a logistics cluster, especially for maritime clusters. Trade policies, if the trade policy for the country or the region changes into much more of a protectionist trade policy, you see the trade drying up through the center, and it can very quickly die out. New technologies. Can a new technology obsolete the need for this? And this is where we come into, what are the distribution technologies for the future going to be? And will they still need a logistics cluster to execute well? Government accountability and efficiency is important. The government needs to set up some of the infrastructure. Then maybe it needs to step out of the way and really enable the companies to prosper while still being a partner in there. The infrastructure inadequacy. We've seen a couple of centers that have started up that really didn't have the infrastructure in place to support it, and they have tended to meander down the road to failure. The other aspect is regional competition. Logistics clusters, once they're successful, tend to breed a lot of imitators, and you see a lot of people coming in a lot of areas. In one way, that's good, but if they're too close to others, one of them is going to fail. That's what happens in most cases. For example, we can have a logistics cluster in Barcelona and one in Zaragoza. There is enough market differentiation and there's enough product flowing. But if you have other ones within 100 kilometers radius, it doesn't quite make sense. Interestingly, there's not a lot of concern about logistics clusters that are very far away from each other, even though they're within the same continent or so. And I'll talk a little bit about some of the cooperation that's going on. So where are these going? A lot of concern is about how do we make these a little bit more global? How do we get them while still satisfying the local needs? How do we address emerging markets? And in Europe, there's a huge concern about sustainability. The picture in the background is the roof of I think this is the General Motors plant in Zaragoza. And a lot of the warehouses in Plaza are following suit on this. Basically, they're installing solar panels on the roofs. Because like I said, you get 300 days of sunshine, and they don't use the roofs for anything. And in fact, in GM's case, GM actually subcontracted out the roof to somebody else. They install the panels, they collect the energy, they feed it into the plant, and they sell it to the network. Also in Spain, you get quite a few benefits for alternate energy sources like wind and solar. I think in Spain now over about 42% of energy is generated from wind and solar that's used there. And Aragon is a net exporter of energy, even though it has no oil and no gas. So that's talking about a logistics cluster. So how do you go about building one? And in European parley, they call it the triple helix. So basically, you need industry, government, and research to do it. More important is vision and leadership and a long-term commitment to make it happen. The challenges: logistics companies are often highly competitive. They compete with each other incredibly, and they have very little time for listening to research and innovation ideas. So one of the things is, how do you integrate these three? And how do you make them work successfully? Industry looks at government as being a regulatory bureaucracy in most cases. How do you change that image of the government? In Aragon, we started this one called ALIA, and basically by bringing together a core group of companies, highly active, highly committed, to actually making something happen. And I say we, justifiably so, because Zaragoza Logistics Center had a core aspect in bringing this together and leveraging some of this. The government agencies involved were very supportive. They provided a lot of seed funding. They provided a lot of involvement, getting the right players involved in permits, and in framing some of the innovation questions. Ideally, you can think about Aragon. Just to give you a scale sample, Aragon, the province of Aragon is the size of Peninsula Malay. It's about 50,000 square kilometers size. The population of Aragon you could probably fit in the city of Petalangjaya. Okay, it's about 1.5 million. But the intent is that you have major rail corridors and freight flow corridors that flow through. This is an idealized map which again puts Zaragoza at the center of the universe, but it isn't really that case, but there is quite a bit of it. So one of the things we said is that logistics is a strategic sector. So who are the partners? We have a whole bunch of companies that are involved. A lot of them are logistics companies. A lot of them are manufacturing companies. So for example, BSH is Bosch Siemens. They make white goods, refrigerators, ovens, heaters, dryers, all that sort of thing. Simply is basically a grocery store chain, a pretty large new one. And of course, you have the R&D institutions and the government institutions, both the government and the European Union. So what happens with this? About 50% of the funding for establishing the cluster comes from government, another 50% from the private industries. And you spend it, on a lot of different things, but mainly focused on projects, about 40 to 50. So what are the types of projects? The easiest way to start getting something off that is to do projects that make sense for the logistics and the companies located there that they couldn't execute themselves. So for example, we've started something called a multi-client freight railway service. Seems pretty straightforward. Run a freight train from Zaragoza to Paris to Brussels that would share cargo. But the railway company wasn't interested to work on that. The individual shippers didn't have enough volume to force a train to be built. But by working together as a cluster, working together all those 30 companies, now you can build a single train every day that goes directly from Zaragoza to Paris with goods that all used to go by truck before. Now you would say, would the trucking companies not like this? Actually, it's interesting. Most of the trucking companies still like it, because they're responsible for the cargo. They get paid. They probably are paying less on the rail than they would pay to have a truck move it, and they're not giving all that money back to their customers. Does it put truck drivers out of work? Remains to be seen. There's enough work going around still. But the companies per se are still working on it. So it's implementation of innovation technology through a collaborative approach and all for an RFID system.
I think he still had a bit more to say, but I think that's the gist of it. Anyways, good morning, and welcome to the second day and session number 3. This session has sort of several components, but its focus is on things that can be done domestically to build capacity to develop supply chains. And so we have this discussion that you heard by video on clusters, which I thought was quite interesting. And I think the interesting part of the presentation was how he kept referring back to how does the coordination take place? What roles does the government have, right? You have a number of companies here, you want to bring them together, you need to supply them a thing. And I thought there was, again, keeping with the theme of the workshop, it's trying to figure out what policies, what role does government have in building supply chains and supporting supply chains. I thought there was some interesting suggestions there, especially that example of the train and coordinating the train. No individual wanted to run that train, but if they got people together, it worked to run that train. So that's that. Unfortunately, we don't have him.